we should make it clear that the exhibition is not about Yale, and it's not about every artist who attended Yale during that period. Instead, it's looking at a network that formed, that a community that developed out of the relationships, out of a need for feedback and support that has very much continued to this day.
There's so many ways to reflect on it. It changes depending on our conversations we have with Michael and Shoshanna or other participants, and then also with academics or curators. It changes because there's so many different reasons and starting points. But for me, it started in undergrad or Miami-Dade Community College, and then School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where we met briefly for 30 seconds in 95 or 94 actually. And it was always the idea to seek out some kind of family surrogate and developed amongst each other, mostly because I felt isolated at the Art Institute of Chicago. Not at Miami-Dade Community College, but at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's a private institution. It's very big. There's a lot of students coming, international students. It was overwhelming, and there weren't a lot of people of color when I was there in 94 through 96. And I just gravitated towards trying to create collectives, exhibits, writing, through different universities as well. And that eventually led to when I applied to grad school. I drove my friend Louis Gisbert to New Haven. I met a lot of the grad students at the time, and so we stayed in touch until I actually applied and went in 2002, and that's where we re-met. And then I met Michael. Before, I think in 2000, I met Anna, who's also participating in the exhibit. Later on, Rashawn, and a ton of people, most of who are in the exhibit. I think they have their own reasons why we gravitated, why we network. My reasons were, it's just an extension of family. Similar or common interests that were not necessarily common or studied in school. And that could be different theories, different logics, music. I always consider Michael a musicologist. We debate about a lot of different types of musicians. But that's kind of like on the surface. A lot of the deeper things are implied in the conversation that we don't go into. The conversation activates certain ideas, certain perspectives, and I would carry that back to my studio and work, or share it with Lauren Holland, who's here also. And then later on, I would, after graduation, I would come back and visit studios, visit the programs, without being invited. Some of the students would invite me. And I remember I visited Abigail early on when she was in school there with Ronnie Quevedo. And I just, you walk in, and then you meet people, and then you try to be supportive. Yeah, that's a small version of it. My time's up.
Well, so Shoshanna, you met William in Chicago briefly.
Yeah.
And now you worked in Chicago at an archive.
Yeah. I went to the Art Institute of Chicago in 91 and graduated in 95. So I took 6 years off between undergrad and graduate school. I felt it was really important to make my own, work outside of undergrad, kind of move myself away from what I was making in school, and find my own voice, live on my own, make my own studio, these kinds of things. And I think while I was working at LaSalle Bank, which was a photography collection, started by Beaumont and Nancy Newhall, who started the collection at MoMA in the 60s. It was a really wonderful experience to sort of see that other side of the art world, the behind the scenes world. But it also informed me that I wanted to make work and not take care of work. Of course, there's the looming student loan and these type of things that you need sort of a day job to do. And for me, that's what it was. And I had mentioned in my talk, having two parents who are artists, it was always like, if you want to keep doing this, you need to have more skills so you can keep doing it. So for me, applying to Yale was based on the curator at the bank who sort of looked at me as I was looking at her miserable, and she said, "You should just apply. You've been getting those application, the books from Yale for like 4 years, And I remember the preparator saying, "But there's no pictures. There's no pictures in there." And I said, "There's a reason why there's no pictures in there." So I knew what I was applying for and what I was applying to, the history of that, and I was focused. I was creating my own thesis, and applying and going through all the rules and regulations of applying with the carousel, by the way, 35 millimeter carousel. And
there's people in the audience.
No, I know.
Have no idea what you're talking about.
I have a studio intern who I needed to pull out the slide projector and be like, "This is technology." But I think that going to school and getting into Yale, there was a big weight, a big relief, and still pinching myself, a surprise. But I think when we got there, and Michael and I are in the same graduating class, you're there for a reason. You have this dedication. I uprooted everything that I had in Chicago, even got into my alma mater, and was like, no, I gotta go and do this. And I think when you getting there and finding a community that was slightly polarizing, and finding the old guard, and being amongst sort of this history, and being around privilege in a way that kind of manifested and was able to negotiate many different avenues that I may not have had, because I had two parents that were artists. Was always thinking about, okay, how am I going to pay for all this when I'm done? But I think that finding similar faces and finding that connectivity with people who didn't come from all of this sort of privilege, and finding that connectivity was sort of, I think, why we gravitated to each other.
It's interesting that so one of the distinguishing things about Yale School of Art is that when the trend in the 90s and definitely in the 2000s was to get rid of the separation between painting and sculpture and photography and make it all pretty much interdisciplinary. But Yale not only held to these separate disciplines, but the departments are actually in separate buildings. And I've heard some funny stories about how the sculpture department felt they were not getting the same treatment, which we won't go in here, that the painting students were getting. But Mike, you went to Yale because it specifically was going to be a focus on painting for you. You got that advice, as I recall, from Kerry James Marshall.
Yeah. I never did well in art classes, so I changed my major to art education. So I studied mostly education classes, and then before I graduated, I had to take one more art class. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to fail this art class. And I took painting, and I really enjoyed it, so I stayed for another semester or something and took more painting classes. But I had very little painting experience. When I was younger, I painted murals in Chicago. But so I didn't think I was a very good painter, even though I loved it. And Carrie Marshall suggested that Yale, because they had these separate programs, that would be a place where I would learn to paint better than other programs where it was more interdisciplinary. And a lot of professors discouraged me from applying there because nobody, they accepted very few people, and no one from our program ever got accepted there. And Carrie Marshall said, I was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't apply. They accept like however many people, 5 or 6 people or whatever. And Carrie Marshall was like, well, you only need 1 space. So, I don't need 5 spaces. So, and that was when I made the decision to apply. So,
what is the application process? And I know that it's different for each of the departments. You're all painting students,
Yeah.
right? We didn't get a sculpture. Okay, well, come on down, sculpture department.
Still not being treated.
I know. What was the process for getting into the into the painting department?
Well, it was 20 some odd years ago, but you did eventually have to actually go there and bring a painting.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
And then you sit your paint. So we're all sitting on this hall. Everybody's got their silly painting, and you have to go in there and sit your painting down. And then there's 2 professors, and I think they generally they're trying to get under your skin. So generally, you have kind of a bad interview, like everybody does.
It's not true. No, but go on.
No, that was the end of my story. You have a bad interview.
You told me that it's different for everyone.
I'm glad I wasn't interviewed by William.
I would know to be faculty.
But that's the end of my story. You have a bad interview, and then you get in.
You made it sound so easy.
Well, I photocopied the entire application, and then I put it up in my apartment, and I highlighted everything that they said, like put the stamp 3 millimeters from the, and like wrap. And I remember my mentor at the time was a curator at LaSalle Bank, and she's like, read everything, because they'll probably throw your carousel out if you don't read it. And last night I was speaking with some of the sculpture students, and they were like, yeah, that happened. Yeah, they would be like, oh, the slide's upside down, and they would just put the entire box.
It's like the last time I did an absentee ballot.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, I mean, it was like, if you want it this bad, you gotta pay attention. Like, that's how, and my mentor did not go to Yale. She was just like, I think you should just make sure everything is, triple check it.
Wow.
Wrap the carousel in brown paper, ship the carousel out. I mean, it was like this whole thing, and make your artist statement 1 page. That was hard.
It was a tedious process to apply. I remember reading that the slide carousel, the generic slide carousel that you purchased, that you had to put brown paper or butcher paper on top, but not completely wrap it. But the way that it was explained, it sounded as if you had to do both. So I actually prepared 2 packages. And then eventually, after some feedback from students, I sent in the one just with the cutout on the surface of on the top of the slide carousel box. And yeah, it was like an operation. You had to, every single step was extremely tedious, and it was extremely, I was a nervous wreck going through this process. I don't know if it was the same for you. Or you,
yeah, I was up. Yeah. It was a good weight loss program for me. Up every night, like, I just, no, it's this, and my whole immune system. This doesn't sound too good. It's a great place.
Mike, you said your interview was difficult.
Well, first I would say that William's strategy of making 2 is brilliant, because even if they throw one out, they still would get one from him.
I was vibing off a text that I read by the artist Julian Schnabel when he applied to the, I believe it was the Whitney ISP program, that he sent his application inside of a sub sandwich. And he thought, when they see that, it's the first thing they're going to pull out because it's just, it's food. So
forgot about that.
I wasn't going to do that. I don't have an ego like that, but or ego. But I made two. I made 2 applications. Yeah. So just because I didn't want to be. It felt like the film Blade Runner. At the beginning, there's an interview process with the replicant.
Yeah, tell us about your mother.
Yeah, my mother. You want me to tell you about my mother? The tortoise. Anyway, well, how was your process?
My process was, I went up there, I had all my work shipped, and then I brought work up. And I was rigorous. It felt like a bad interview.
Mm.
And in fact, I did wear, because I was working at a bank, I was wearing like my bank outfit. Like I approached it like it was, a job interview. And I remember just sending bullet questions off. Why do you want to be here? What is this about? What's this? Oh, we're doing this. I was like, okay. And then, I think, it was. I made work at a local print shop in Chicago, Anchor Graphics. So I was making work for this experience. So I was really formed, and like I had I knew what I was doing. It wasn't like I didn't know what I was doing. And the experience was like, oh my gosh, it's over. Now I'm going to take the airport van back to Newark Airport because that was my transportation at the time.
What? So were you surprised when you got the envelope that said you're in?
I thought I didn't get in because it was such a thin envelope. We were talking about that last night. A few of us hung out at the club. No, we hung out at the hotel, and we talked about how I came back. I did this last hurrah trip. Like I went to Paris. I was like, this is going to be the last time I'm ever going anywhere for a long time. Came back and it was like, oh, okay, well. And then my partner at the time was like, no, open it. See, you got in. It's like they're just going to tell you, and then they'll send you a whole bunch of stuff. And I got it, and I was like, oh my God, it was crazy for me. I don't know about, did you think you got in?
No, of course I wouldn't assume.
No,
but
of course.
Before I applied, I bought a book about applying to graduate school, and they said apply to 7 schools, so I applied to 7 schools. So that one was one of many. So it was less nerve-wracking in some way, even though it was different from all the other applications, because the others weren't like you have to wrap the slide carousel in a particular way. And I didn't have to go there and bring work for the others.
How many interviews did you do with different universities?
Maybe I did 3.
Okay.
So Northwestern, UCLA.
I only did one with a Hunter and Yale. And Hunter was an awful interview. Yeah.
On your part or on theirs?
Of course, my part.
I interviewed. I had a SAIC. I didn't interview though. The School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I also applied for the Masters in Art Administration program, and I got into both. And then Yale was that was like the trip. Yeah, and I got into UIC. And Columbia, but I was like, I'll just go with Yale.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so you applied, but why did you apply? I know, William, it wasn't that it was Yale or Yale, right? It was, you had a very specific reason why you wanted to be at that school.
Yeah. But before we go on to that, I had a really, I had a wonderful experience with my interview. It was, I don't know, they were really interested in how I was thinking and why I was producing what I was producing and what direction I was coming from, because it was completely outside of what they were interested in or talking about or familiar with in the institution. And my points of references they couldn't understand or were not familiar with at all. They didn't read the literature. They didn't read or see this type of cinema. Most of it was foreign. The visual artists that I referenced, they knew nothing about or had never heard of.
Wow.
And when they ask me about what I think about so and so and so and so, I gave them an honest answer, but also not a yay or nay. I gave them reasons why these artists were strong or the works were weak, and ended up going for 30 minutes. And when I walked out, I felt very very happy. But of course, you never know. You could be happy, and they're kind of thinking, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So I didn't know whether I was going to get in or not. I mean, I had some kind of joy, but at the same time, you just never know. So the other question was about why I chose to go to the school. A few reasons. I think it was mostly because I knew that I needed to go to grad school. I reached a point where I couldn't develop on my own critically. And I thought I could. I thought I could just go to undergrad and that's it. I didn't think there was anything to do in grad school. What for? But then when my friends applied and went, they didn't tell me they were applying and going. They just did it. And then I got recruited to drive them, or one of them. So what I saw within a year's time was a huge development on their part. And I realized that there is a way out. I don't have to get down and depressed and feel that there is no more here. So I started the process. But it took me a little while because a friend of mine, like Michael Richards, said, you need to go to grad school. You need to go to these schools. And Yale was one of them. Columbia was another. And I have to go to I opted to apply for a few schools. And I went to this school because two of my friends were there. And I wanted to go where there was a familiar face. I don't know anybody else in the other schools. And I'd had a similar experience at the Art Institute of Chicago when I first got there. It was very difficult because of that. So the other reason was because I wanted to study with D.A. Pennybaker, who was a filmmaker, and Dr. Kelly Jones, in art history. But she has since left and now is at Columbia.
But it was also to be part of a legacy of artists who had been there before.
I wasn't thinking about that.
No.
No, not necessarily. There were a lot of artists who I admired,
Right.
but I didn't have the ego to want to be part of that legacy. Who knows how one is going to finish, or if one finishes at all. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was admiring
Or at least
artists.
being at a school of artists that you admired.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. And then a lot of that changed. Meeting a lot of these artists, it changed because we had a lot of commonalities and or even things that we had nothing in common. That challenged us. It challenged me also.
I would just also say that William was doing work that is more interdisciplinary than they were used to, right? And more
It's a big problem.
international than they were used to.
Yeah.
And Shoshanna was interested in this work about identity that they were not used to or maybe even interested in, let's say. And I was just like an abstract painter working in a language they understood and so forth. So we all had very different, they looked at us very differently, I
Yes, and as a female
think, as a woman.
student, it was quite an interesting and experience of being like, why are you giving that person a studio visit with so and so? And there's some female artists here that would like students, that would like to get a studio visit. There's a little bit of favoritism that I always was sort of like, oh, great, it's the same, it's like.
And with that gender issue too, and also racial, and also this idea of lineage, did you say? I guess it was always understood that there was an issue of art form or something that said artists who were inspired by Picasso, and the artists were women and they were minorities and there were all these people. But it was weird because I understood that in our political system, to be in a lineage, not only do you have to be inspired by somebody, but you have to be able to inspire further people down the line. And so it was understood that version of the magazine, so maybe Lisa Yuskavich maybe was in this. But I knew, looking at that magazine, that in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, there's not going to be a version of this with Lisa Yuskavich on the cover and who was inspired by her. So you cannot be a part of a lineage, you know? You wouldn't be allowed to.
And she had a horrible time at Yale. At least that was her story when she went, you know.
Yeah, so did Hillary Harkness. She also.
Yeah. But that was a different time also.
So one of the things that being at Yale or any graduate school does is it does give you the time to concentrate on your work and be with people who do share your interests. But did the faculty ever change, as for instance with you having all these references they didn't know them, but were they open to understanding your perspective? Or did they want you to change and work in a way that they would understand or place within their idea of the Western canon of contemporary art?
It's, I think I had a particular way of speaking to faculty in undergrad that I approached in grad school with, and it got shut down. So I immediately had to go and elaborate more where I was coming from. Why is this film or this writer being referenced? Who is Jorge Luis Borges? And then they wanted more, and then they come back later for more, and every week they wanted more, and it was, you know, the studio visit lasted, 30 minutes and 40 minutes and then an hour and a half. And it's supposed to be the other way around. They're supposed to be providing the feedback, not me giving and generating information to them. So at the end of the day, I felt I was still hungry. So it was,
and that's when you start reaching out to
you
other
have
artists.
to, yeah, because if you don't have a plate of food in front of you, go somewhere else and look for it.
And the role of the visiting artists and critics was also very important. It filled in the gaps.
There was a lot of visiting artists. I don't know if you guys were in your first year or second, but there was a lot of visiting artists and scholars at the art history department, but they didn't share that information with the painting or the sculpture or graphic design or the architecture department, which I found those departments a little more interesting, the visitors. For our department, it tended to be straight up painters, but outside of their presentation, studio visits, there wasn't that generosity. There wasn't a connect a lot of times. But that all depended on who they got for that semester. Yeah.
So describe the reaching out to each other and the relationships that started to develop, and then William, you talk about collectives, and it was interesting to see for the new Whitney Biennial that opened this week, that collectives, the idea of a collective is also forefront, but this is something that you all have been referencing throughout this process.
Yeah, I just made it up. I used to, when I was in middle school, I made up a gang just so I wouldn't get beat up. I stopped short of making jackets, but
Satin jackets?
no.
Okay.
But now you've got one.
I have a sweater.
I just
Go ahead.
Yeah, just in terms of like the faculty at Yale, I was really spoiled at the Art Institute of Chicago. I had a lot of professors that were female. I had a lot of professors, like John Roselle was a painting professor at Art Institute of Chicago, and I had a real diverse set of faculty there. So as an undergrad, I had faculty that looked like me, who could identify, and I think it's something to do with living in Chicago as a city, which in and of itself has its own divisions, North Side, South Side, Cubs, the Sox. There was always this, duality, and I think that in that world of undergrad, I was sort of expecting, I shouldn't assume, but I was expecting that kind of engagement with faculty, more broad, and a great undergraduate experience for me. But that's how I went into it. And so I came into that with like, hey, I applied and I got in with the slides that I put in the carousel, so I'm ready to move to the next, what, no, okay, only one other person has done this in the world, you know, which they would tell me Adrienne Piper is the only artist that, you know, did identity art, and she's done it, so you don't have to do that, you know, like, okay, good. But I think in terms of their question and the Made Up Collective, we started doing, I remember doing studio, like we're doing our own critiques, you know, like, hey, how you doing? What's going on? Oh man, I need help with this. I just had this crazy critique with so-and-so. You know, so a lot of moments of like sitting in the lounge or coming to the studio and each of us critiquing each other's work and getting feedback that way. I think for me that's how I, you know, reaching out to people in sculpture, had a few people in sculpture that would come and I would go to their studios. And you know, even though it was so far away from the printmaking department, painting department, just kidding. But you know, and like so having that community, and then also making my own interdisciplinary courses. Like I took photography, and like I just was like, I'm just going to do this. Like I'm paying for this. Like yeah. So you know, so I kind of like I think that's how we started to evolve and create our own and sort of forget the other faculty. So yeah.
Well, Mike, when you went and you were painting, and
I was painting abstract paintings that the professors understood.
So they understood your work, and you made it so they would understand it, or this was what you wanted to make and they understood it?
I guess that's where my trick worked too well in the end. Is that well, I guess first I'll say that kind of trauma of the professors sitting there and pulling out of you rather than giving you, that was so real that for many years afterwards, I'm a visiting artist and things, and I would go into the studio of minority MFA students and I would be like, do not become a storyteller. Like, I'm going to sit here and just give me a minute and I'll look at the work and then I'll talk to you. Because if you start talking about like where you came from while you're making the work, then the professor will just sit there and listen, and then you won't get anything. And so the reason why I think we started talking to each other is just that we were willing to give and not take anything. So like William would come into my studio uninvited.
He used to come into my office at the museum
and like start judging things and like talking about things without asking me to do any work for him. And then that just became a thing we would do, is that we would look at each other's work without asking you to do any work for me. So I would say that, and I would also say that like with gender and with race in the art world as well, like Georgia O'Keeffe, we all know who Georgia O'Keeffe is, but there's not like a school of painting that comes out of Georgia O'Keeffe. There was this idea that you could be famous but not significant. Like you couldn't be a sign within this symbolic language of history. And I think that idea that minority and women artists could be famous but not significant, maybe they felt like our work operated in a post-critical space. Like we didn't even need to be critiqued because of the way our work was going to operate in the world. So like if you were a black artist painting black bodies, then you were fine, and they didn't need to engage with the work critically. If you were a white guy painting geometric abstraction, you were fine. They didn't need to engage with you critically.
And also, the legacy they spoke of in 2000 was not what it is today. Today, people are very familiar with Barclay Hendricks. Back then, most people didn't know. When Kehinde started doing his paintings, people didn't reference Barclay because they didn't know about him, even though he graduated from Yale. Howardina Pindell, who was an artist and also a curator at MoMA from 68 to 78, was not even part of the conversation. But we were aware of them. I was aware of them in undergrad. I even reached out to Barclay when I was in grad school. I wanted to do a little documentary, and how the documentary downstairs was made is I tended to tape everyone or everyone's work. And so I was trying to create an archive because I felt that these individuals were part of that legacy, but it wasn't part of this mainstream legacy. It wasn't part of the conversation. And then it wasn't until Travis Schoonmaker who would illuminate Barclay Hendricks' career.
Curator.
The curator. So that aside, I would say that also what Michael shared is what differed just any grad school and any student sharing conversations with one another. What differed for us was that we were less in numbers, and so we tended to gravitate with more rigor towards our practice, paying attention to that, and how we navigated through the system, because it wasn't as generous. We had to manipulate it and transform it in order to get something out of it. It wasn't like my next door neighbor, my next studio neighbor. They were getting what they paid for. I had to go and
You had to search for what you needed, and that search was to the other students.
um,
And they've reached
yeah.
out. What became a sort of collective.
Yeah.
You called it. You came up with a name for your collective.
Well, there's a couple.
Coffee.
We had the Base Collective. I know Michael didn't participate in that. It was a few of us
I was
from.
not invited.
You weren't invited.
Nor was I.
Well,
Gee, who
because no, it was because I think when Michael graduated, he already had representation. That was unheard of, in our world, in our little world at school.
To have gallery representation.
Right.
Yeah.
And so he was big, and he just kind of drifted off to this the art world of New York, while the rest of us was struggling and applying to residencies and stuff like that.
We'll get back to the residences, but I did want.
That was that moment where my trick worked too well.
Yeah.
Because I made this work that the professors would
That's
understand
what I wanted to
so
get
that they
at.
could talk about it, and then they talked about it. But then when I went out into the art world, I did a show, and Roberta Smith in the New York Times wrote a review of it, and she was talking about me being a New York school painter and Ad Reinhardt, and I was like, whoa. The language I had learned in school worked fine in our context of school. We could talk. But out in the world, I didn't want to be misidentified in that way, So I had to change what I was doing and learn other languages from the world, So, yeah.
And language actually entered actual language, but also code information or symbolic information. How did you arrive at what you're doing now? Because it has nothing to do with abstract expressionism, other than it's painterly and shaped canvases but it's truly uniquely your own. What was your process? It didn't happen at Yale, it happened afterwards. How did you make such a big change in your work?
Teaching helped a lot, because one reason I like teaching at Yale as a visiting critic and things like that is because the issues that are going to be important are kind of already important there. The students are wrestling with things that are going to be an issue in a few years in the world. And one of the issues that came up there early was empathy. You hear empathy a lot now in culture and a value to that. And Arthur Jaqua did this video. I forget the exact title, but the message is love. Love is the message, and the message is death. And after George Floyd's killing, a lot of cultural institutions, 10 museums all over the world, showed the work simultaneously. And Arthur Jaqua was asked how he felt about it. And he was saying how, people would come up to him and they would be crying and telling them how much they were moved by the work, but he was ambivalent because he wasn't sure how he felt about this kind of microwave empathy, is I think what he called it. And I had students who were dealing with this same kind of question of, I'm making this work about this group of people I feel passionate about, but how does the audience actually feel? And I thought to myself, well, you could do an experiment. What you would do is you would make work about another community and then see how you felt. And then that would logically be how the audience would feel when you make work about your community. And so that is actually that wrestling with empathy that all of my students were doing is what led me out of my favored mode of painting, which is I paint abstract spaces that have atmosphere, maybe some architecture, maybe some text, maybe some geometry, but I don't paint people. But in order to engage with what they were wrestling with, I had to start painting people somehow. And that's wrestling with how to paint people and objects when that's not my druthers is what led to the kind of, and also empathy is a kind of filter so that I don't experience all of the pain of the world. And messing with that filter let in so much kind of trauma that it really kind of shattered my ability to make pictures. And so that created the kind of struggle that my paintings try to embody. So it comes a lot from teaching.
So that's interesting that you, well, in a way you got from your students that.
I was pulling out of my students
instead
of.
Yeah. But that, I mean, because they are so amazing and so different from what you were doing at Yale. With William, what was interesting about the Miami artists who went, you, Louis Gisbert, John Espinosa, was, you came from an environment in Miami that was already like this, Miami in the 90s, that's when this international art scene was growing. There was several generations of artists already here that were mentors. And, you had gone to the Art Institute of Chicago, so did Louis, and where did John go?
He went to New World School of the Art.
New World, so,
yeah.
But you all were very, very active in the mid to late 90s in Miami with the beginnings of a career and also a professionalism. You curated over 20 exhibitions between 1998 and 1999.
No, not that many, but I was curating a lot with Jean Moreno and myself, yeah.
So you came in with a kind of a different perspective than a lot of the other students that went to Yale. You also came from a community in which there was, South Florida's community and the art community was very diverse. And then to go either to Chicago or Yale was a very different experience. So you already came with I've known your work, I guess, since 96, or maybe a little earlier, and there's a continuity from that time till today. How did it change being at Yale?
I think because of the exchange that I had with my peers, it just became a lot more rigorous, more informed. I became more informed because of just a lot of conversations, and we overlapped years. So it was when they left, there was a new class coming in, and it started again, and we built our communities that way. And you mentioned collectives. That was a way to keep our conversations going, because oftentimes grad students misunderstand what grad school is about. And as soon as they graduate, they just go their own ways and they meet up for beers and that's about it. But if you don't keep that type of rigorous conversation, intimate and honesty with each other, you end up isolating yourself to the point where you get stuck and you don't evolve anymore. And so oftentimes somebody might find success and they'll get to a point where they don't know which way to go anymore because there's nobody around them that they can trust. It happens a lot to musicians and other creative folks. And so I had seen that too many times before, and I didn't want to go that route. So I tried to create make up these collectives, the Bass Collective, the Coffee Cup Collective. I tried to curate and include all of us, or as many as we could. And some people just didn't want to participate. They didn't want to be part of that conversation, so they would leave.
And it's the one who were participating that are in our show. So that's
Yeah.
one of the distinguishing factors about it.
Well, that was around 2009 when I started reflecting on the fact that many of the artists that we were working with were also influenced by similar things. We were showing the same places. And I talked to Coco Fusco, the curator, author, about this, the fact that a lot of the people who came out of Yale that were really successful have been students of color within the millennium. And there was a similarity in a lot of our approaches and works and conversations or influences. And then jump about 10 years later, in our conversation, I brought it up as, these are the facts, and there's so much behind it. I think it was around 2018 that we had a conversation, because you talked to me about the Making Art in Miami from 2000.
That was a show I had organized. It's almost like
Right.
similar concept of that 90s generation of Miami
Right.
artists.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but this was a specific institution where all of us were locked up in. Yeah.
You reminded me of something a Professor Mel Bachner said, where he said that the problem with being of the moment is that you have to wait for someone else to define the moment. And I think that maybe being not accepted there, like, forced that generation of artists of color to invent. Because I think that, a lot of us have invented modes, as Anna was saying, with rather than doing the thing that the community already did, wanting to expand something.
And that's what was one of the things that interested me with this period, and why it developed into an exhibition, is that indeed you did collectively make a change, or contributed to the change in contemporary art. And the discourse, not only the art discourse, but a general audience discourse, and the way art is being taught. I mean, both of you are been teaching for a long time. How does your
Not as long.
well, you both teach
Well,
in,
yeah.
in art schools.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, not as long as mine, but
How did you've already talked about how that practice has affected you?
in terms of
What you tell me some good stories about how you approach your students.
I always include better practices. I always tell the students about art administration. I'm sort of like relaying what my parents relayed to me. You want to be an artist, you got to find all these other tools so you can support yourself. And I think that's what my parents instilled in me. Like, oh, you want to go to art school? Yes. And having two parents that went to SVA, School of Visual Arts, they were like, okay, you can do this, but you need to take blind typing when there was actually typewriters in high school. This Macintosh thing came out. Maybe we should get a computer and learn that. So it was like always bringing in skills. There was never a question of you can't make art. It was like a question of how can you navigate through this world where art is over there, and everyone wants you to be a doctor and a lawyer. And so how can you put yourself in the same around the same table? And so I think when I was at McMill Stewart Endowed Chair at Maryland Institute College of Art for 2 years, I was a visiting artist and critic for the senior undergraduate thesis students. And, I started before the pandemic, and we were in class. I'd always tell them, they'd always want to know more about what's it like when you're out of school, And then the pandemic hit, and it was almost as if they were already out of school, working from home, even though we were doing, virtual learning. I said, you're already there. You already got your studio set up in your apartment. You've already done what I had to learn to do when I was an undergrad. And so the year after, I was invited back during COVID, And then I just got hired. I just was actually invited to be adjunct faculty in painting at Rutgers Newark. And so I'm telling those students, which are, some are majors and some are non-majors, about how to navigate. We just did a professional art hanging class, so they could hang their artwork. Telling them how to utilize that, the verbiage of that, you know, and so extending it just from beginning painting to, these are careers you can have. You could work at a museum, and then you could still afford to have a studio or make your largest room in your apartment your studio. And so kind of like navigating that. I mean, I think that as a professor, it reminds me why I'm an artist and why what I do is so unique and special. And imparting that to them, especially telling them that, you know, I mentioned this during my artist talk, but during people ask, how are you doing? Oh my God, the pandemic. I'm like, I'm doing great. This is awesome. You know, I love isolation. I'm in my cave. I like social distancing, you know. I'm a creature, I'm a hermit.
Not that it was such a positive.
No, but for me, I had a place to go.
Yeah.
Like
I heard that from most artists.
Yeah, I mean, I've had friends.
Their life hadn't changed much before.
Yeah, I mean, I've had friends who went to high school with, and they were like reaching out. Oh my gosh, I love what you're doing, and I'm like, well, how are you doing? They go, well, I just realized that all I do is go to my job and then I shop at the mall.
Oh God.
And so I don't have that. I have making. I have, you know, I can always resource. I can use my resources, and so that's what I instill in my students. You know, how do you make something out of nothing? And how do you continue to make that? And yeah.
Well, the other thing, and again, the show is not about Yale, but as important as having gone to Yale and having the time to be there and make these connections and make your work was the residencies, the artist residency programs. And I know, you know, there were some artists that went more the route of the commercial art world. But then there's others like William, who chose to go the route of artist residencies. Can you talk about the role that these artists in residence programs play and how important it's been for you particularly in your work?
There's a lot of benefits to starting out or trying out an art residency because it gives you the time and space from a week to 2 years oftentimes. Sometimes they have honorariums. Sometimes they don't, but the space is really what we need all the time. And when you're in school, if you could do a residency, that's really, really a plus because you can actually, oftentimes if you're in grad school, you don't have a lot of other obligations. You just have to focus on school. And as soon as you graduate, you usually don't have still other obligations other than loans. So doing a residency can give you a studio without having to pay for it. It can give you an area to help you with everyday costs of living, depending on where you're living also. So there's a lot of perks to it. But what I didn't know is that doing a residency can also support and network or validate your work without you trying to go and do exhibits or try to knock on curators' doors. Especially me, I'm not very outgoing or charming or anything like that, unlike Michael.
What does that mean? I'm charming. I'm very pleasant.
You were already there. But I ended up doing it from 2004 to 2014. It became part of my practice. And within that, I also just cultivated a lot more communities and artists in different cities and was able to just go back and forth and generate a lot more for the art community and for communities in general than if I had just chosen another path.
And in a way, it's a form of education for you.
Sure.
You come across other students and other artists.
It's mentorship for me.
Mentoring.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is that's well, I know we're sort of running out of time, but is it? I mean, I've always questioned the validity of the MFA program. It's expensive. You know, we talked about some of the the issues. It's not just Yale. It's, many of the other programs out there. Is there an alternative?
My late mother, who would always be like, more education, more education. She, I think that I think that you get a master's degree so you can be a professor.
And that's what the original purpose of it was.
Yeah, I have students going, oh, can I be a professor like you? I'm like, well, you have to get a master's degree.
From so many of the artists that I had talked to, they said really if they didn't have this support, it would have been really tough to get through Yale, or even on with a career. That this was a very special, and I don't think that happens all the time. I think you all worked at it, and I think you all have that generosity in you. I've really enjoyed working with all the artists in the show, and it is, it is one of the things that's now reaching out to the next generation, and which I think really is very important and special.
Well, I make work because it's the only thing that I'm really good at. It's like the longest relationship I've had in order to express myself. So, I make work so I can tell the world my story, and if some people like to hear more about it or like to look at it, then I'll keep making. But then I also want to be making and evolve my story, because my story changes, every day. And then that process leads to other work. It's a hard question to ask, actually. It's so internal for me.
Well, it's like making a meal. 'Cause sometimes you're hungry, you make something to eat, to fill yourself up. But then sometimes you cook something that you really want to savor, and you might want to share sometimes, but not always share. So it changes. It's not always to fill yourself up. It's not always for yourself either. Sometimes you want to cook, and you enjoy the idea of sharing that work, or omelet. But when you're doing it from 2 years old and up, and obsessively, that all kind of goes out the window. It's not even part of the the conversation anymore. It's just the obsession, and you plow through almost everything because of that. So,
how important is it to be understood? You said your faculty understood those paintings. How important it is, you're making things that are very personal to you, very, obsessive, as you say. Do you care if someone gets what you are trying to do?
As a woman, as a female artist, when I do talk about my work, my story, I do have people of very diverse backgrounds going, I totally get it. My Haitian grandmother thinks I'm too American, and I totally understand that figure, and that's me, and so that there's this relationship between like connectivity as a female artist, a Caribbean American. Like, I think that there, and maybe it's, I don't know if it's gender or, but for me it's like I do like to talk about my work, because my work is visible, but my story is unique, and why not? Because then that creates a chain of this connectivity between the work and other people's work, and then even people who don't make art can find that connection between my work and something else in their lives. So I think that's your answer. Okay.
Leslie Hewitt, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, she actually said something that I feel really does tie a lot of the artists together. It's that she says, my art is this and this and this. It's when people want an explanation, what is your art about? It isn't this one thing. It's this and this and this, and I loved that very succinctly explains, it just keeps expanding. So it might mean something, just that one thing to you, but if you spend more time, and I think that's very indicative of all the work in this exhibition, you're going to get it at one level, but then the deeper you go, the more you're going to get it, and then you get you're going to get that, and then that. And I think that that's the real pleasure of, you know, all of your work. It's not, you can't boil it down to some simple, this is what your work is
Yeah,
about.
because I'm not boiled down to one word.
Mm-mm.
So, you know, that.
Thus, we have very long text panels.
Yes.
I would say that I'm unfortunately what they call an artist's artist. Like, I make art for other artists. Like, when I make a show, I think about how William will respond to it. And I want him to be, you know, they say that freedom is the ability to make an unlooked for future, like a human ability to make something tomorrow that nobody was expecting or looking for. And I try to do that with the artists I know. So I want Rashawn and William and Shoshanna to see something in my painting that they didn't know a painting could even do. Yeah, so that's my audience.
I had the idea that because I got in on my merit and my work, and then I had to go through all the same stuff again. You know, it was like, it's kind of like, what are you? Wait, you're Jamaican? You don't look Jamaican. So it was all these macro aggressions that I had to be like, wait, can we just talk about the work? Like, why do I have to constantly explain my history when Jojo, you know, who put his work up, no one has to explain. He doesn't have to explain himself constantly. And I think that was a constant explanation. Like, I had to prove myself through, but also have gone through the same rigor to get into school.
So not having gotten in wasn't the leveling factor, is what I'm hearing you're saying. I mean, it would.
I mean, that's just the first step on the board game.
But gender and race didn't somehow muddy the waters for you, because you said you felt isolated. All of you did.
Sure, I was. I remember. I mean, there's a ton of scars that you carry. You just.
And you don't talk about necessarily.
Yeah. It comes out in the work, whether I like it or not. But you know, you learn to channel that early on, because the Ivy League is not the only place you're going to experience this. So you're growing up experiencing it. By then you figured out how to sidestep landmines. It doesn't stop. It becomes sometimes a hyper version of what you experience outside. So I would get stopped by security, which is the New Haven police, on my way to class, or coming in or out of a building, because I don't look like what a student's supposed to look like. So, or I get people assume that I'm a maintenance person, or the students who I'm my peers. I think that I'm only there because of affirmative action, that I have no other, no merit. Right, and that's it. They completely thought I was ignorant because of what I looked like, and I'm sure they thought about that about every other person of color. They just didn't share it. They just felt bold enough to share it with me. So.
And a few years later, there was an article. I forget where it was. Maybe it was the New York Times or something. And a professor had said something in that article that made it seem like they accepted us to do us a favor, like as if they didn't. And then it made you think, I think I'm a good painter, but for them it didn't even matter. Like they were just choosing like 3 black people or something. And you know, and as a professor, I taught at Brooklyn College, and once my chair, she was saying, you know, you're a really great teacher and painter, and we didn't choose you because you were black. And I was like, now I think that you chose me because I didn't ask. And there was also an art dealer, because in the olden days, art galleries were more segregated than they are now. There were galleries that showed black artists and galleries that did not. And a dealer was talking to me about showing my work, and he mentioned that he wasn't doing it because I was black. And that's always a bad sign. And also in New York, they started stop and frisk. Like we started on 9/11, and when we got to New York, they started stop and frisk. And you know, I started working in commercial galleries, and I went to the gallery and got my check for selling paintings. And I was walking out, and the police stopped me. You know, I fit the description of somebody who was going around robbing galleries or something. So all that stuff is underneath what we're talking about, but we do not talk about it.
I want to thank all of you, all the artists. It has been outstanding working with you. I hope you've all seen the show. It's going to be up for several months, so it is a show that you have to keep coming back and looking at and experiencing. And I am particularly very appreciative of William, who has been, I email him constantly, we meet, and he's been so helpful. Mike for being on the advisory committee along with Leslie Hewitt and Dr. Irene Small. It's been a great process. It's not ending. The only difference is I didn't wake up at 3 in the morning to write another text panel today. So it's been an incredible experience, and I'm so appreciative of everybody. I'm appreciative of my staff, our education curator, Lisa Quinn, and an assistant education curator, Michael Belham. And is Sue still here? Okay, and Sue Girardi, who has been outstanding, and all the museum staff.